Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, first part there are for Saturday the 5th of October 2024. Hello team, good to have you on board. Let's look at the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. I had a massive message yesterday, or not message, a comment on a thread criticising basically everything I do in these videos. And I said, sorry mate, but all of these points have been addressed in my videos previously. But of course, unless you watch all my videos, you don't know of all my rationale behind how I do what I do in this, particularly in this first video, how I do it, why I do it, etc., and how much justification there is behind what I claim, which has been built up over 2 years plus of doing this, right? Every single freaking day. And so I have quite a good grasp over what the stats are that are claimed by the Ukrainian General Staff themselves. And people like Dell have helped out with compiling these data analyses or data presentation, and then I do the analysis on top of what the Ukrainian General Staff say. So the question is the Ukrainian General Staff what they claim at all justifiable? Are we justified in believing what they say? And then we look at the Russian stats for what they're worth, which is virtually nothing, and see whether what they claim is at all reasonable. And then we draw conclusions, and then I add data points to this, and we look at videos and see what little nuggets we can draw from these videos. Remember, there are dozens and dozens, hundreds of videos a day that I could show you. Don't have time, so I just pick a couple here and there to give you a sense of what's going on. And it's always looking at whether these figures from the General Staff are at least somewhat reliable. And we have all sorts of sources, including intelligence conclusions from international partners and agencies and what they claim. Then we have sources like Mediadzona and BBC Russia, and we look at their probate record analyses and their social media obituaries and death reports analyses, and we plug all of this stuff and we plug it in. We work out what's going on, and all the anecdotes that over time become an indication of trends or actual, I think, we can draw significant conclusions from a vast number of anecdotes. Remember, the plural of anecdote isn't data, but they are data points, right? And so on and so forth. And virtually every single criticism this guy leveled at me had been answered before. So what I'm going to do is a kind of reference video that looks at all of his criticisms, and that will also be a reference video for people seeking to understand what I'm doing in these initial videos. Okay, that aside, Ukrainian General Staff figures and all the caveats apply, so don't throw criticisms at me without reading the freaking caveats below in the description, yeah? So all of those caveats are in the description to the video below. We have 1,280 personnel lost. That's edging up towards that arbitrary upper end of the range, 1,300 that I say. That's kind of what we've been seeing more often than not, 1,000 to 1,300, but we have been over that a number of times recently, and 1,280 is very high. 8 tanks losses on the daily average. That's, I think, a relatively high number, suggesting that the Russians, I know it's on the daily average, but we have seen days of 0, 4, 3. I think when you have a daily average number like 8 tanks lost, it shows that the Russians are definitely attacking. And when that is supplemented by 31 troop carrying air feeds, which is about double, just under double the daily average, then I think, yeah, the Russians are attacking. And again, if you want to take 10%, 15% off those figures, go for it. It's still going to tell you exactly the same conclusion. 72 artillery systems is a bonkers number, right? So let's go back to the datasheet from Dell. Good old Dell, total legend. Shame he's moving house because we've had some beers together. Okay, so we have what we're looking at. artillery, aren't we? So artillery plus, so that's a daily one, 72. It's a darkish red, which means it's a bad day at the office for the Russians in that category. Then we look across here and we look at the average. The mean average has shot up now. It is almost 20. That's interesting because when I was looking at the mean average last, I remember it at like 15. Now we're moving to 20. And that shows you that the last few months, I mean, if we go back and look at the data across several weeks worth of artillery losses, let's just look at what the Ukrainians are claiming the Russians are losing on a daily basis. So 17th of September, really low day, 6, up to 25, 23, 35. And even those aren't particularly high, even though they're above the daily average. Like, it's not particularly dark red. 58, 63, 81, 61, 74, 71, 58, 55, 62, 27, 33, 14, 37, 59. And there we go. Oops, I'm pressing the wrong arrow there. 59, and then today's 72. So that is why the daily average, the mean average, is shooting up. When the daily average has been around sort of 15 to 20, and you're getting virtually every day of like 40 to 80, that is going to shift up. We have the record high is 81, so 72 is incredibly high, all things considered. The 7-day rolling average is 43. So your daily average is 20, but over the last 7 days, it's 43.4. And over the last month, so this whole month has seen 43.73. So that is incredibly high. I presume the numbers above that, Dell, are the records for a 7-day rolling average and a 30-day rolling average. So we are seeing pretty high in both at the moment, but it's not as high as it has been at certain points in the past. Okay, so that to me suggests that the Ukrainians are going mental at, well, that's a bit, let's be a bit more formal in our language, shall we? They are trying very hard they are explicitly attempting to degrade the Russian artillery systems, as they have been since really May 2023, during the difficult period of the initial counterattack that they put on, particularly in the south, where they realized that they were getting hammered by Russian artillery. They were in these sort of kill boxes of the fortifications, minefields, slowing the mechanized assaults down. They were hoping to go 30 kilometers a day. They end up going just meters a day. And the Russians were just piling in all sorts of ATGMs, helicopters with their ATGMs as well, anti-tank guided missiles, and artillery and mortars, all piling in on the Ukrainian advances. And it was fairly catastrophic in a number of places like Manatok, Machka. It was at that moment that the Ukrainians decided that they needed to really degrade the Russian artillery in a very substantial way. And we can tell this. I know, I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. We can then look at the data to suggest that that is indeed what's happened. So I know my face is going to be in the way of some of this. Let's try and make it a little bit smaller, actually, so you can see the whole lot. Okay, so this is, most of the war up until, this is the war up until May 2023. And look at the increase there. You can tell by the gradient of the blue line, which is the total numbers, it gets steeper. And if it's steeper, you're losing more stuff. And the trend line starts going up as well. And then it's kind of leveled a little bit around here, and then it's gone up massively. Dipped randomly for a wee while, but it's gone right back up again. And that you can see in the trend lines there. But the point being that it was from May, it was from this point here, the counterattack starting, that the Ukrainians really worked on attriting the Russian artillery. And the losses have been fairly staggering. And it's about justifying whether these figures are correct. Well, when you start seeing a visually confirmed loss list, as I showed you over the last couple of days, containing, 5 M46s, when you're going and using a 1950s howitzer, and you're losing not just one of those, but a number of those, then yes, it suggests that those huge stockpiles that we have seen satellite imagery of have been degraded, and they are desperate, because that is reflected in the use of such an old howitzer. Okay, Again, piecing all these bits of the jigsaw together. I don't think my conclusions have been wrong at all in anything I've said to do with this kind of analysis. I don't think I've had to go, oh, by the way, everything I was telling you the last couple of months was completely wrong. I've got it wrong because X, Y, Z. I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I am defending my conclusions and, the work I've been doing for a couple of years here. And that's then backed up by covert cabal and high-marsden people and John P. going and looking at these satellite images in fine detail and giving you the databases that they have of the trends and the raw numbers of depletion of those stockpiles, and it all feeds into this, and they wouldn't be depleting those deep stockpiles and then bring out M46s if they weren't losing howitzers at this tremendous level, given that they had gajillions of howitzers to start with when you understand their deep stockpile numbers. 4 multiple launch rocket systems to lose in one day is really high. Remember, we saw 8 lost in a day, was it this week? Again, let's go to the data sheet and make sure that I am not talking absolute garbage. When we look at MLRS, we had 8 yesterday. Yeah, so yesterday it was 8. So 4 today is a really high number in that category. 5 anti-aircraft warfare systems is a huge number to lose on a daily basis, given that anti-aircraft warfare are, let's know, we want to look at anti-aircraft. There we go. So to lose 5 today when the daily average is 1, almost on the noggin now, 1, and the MLRS is 1.27. So to lose 4 MLRS is 3 times the daily average, and 5 anti-aircraft warfare systems is 5 times the daily average. 85 vehicles and fuel tanks is very high, and 11 pieces of special equipment also high. So, okay, we can say that this is exaggerated by 10% or whatever. You're still going to get broadly the same conclusions that I'm giving you. Okay, let's piece some more data points together. More than 250 Russian Marines died near Vuhledar, the BBC reports. The elite units of the Russian Federation lost 4 times more people in a year of fighting near Vuhledar than in 10 years of the war in Chechnya. 211 Marines of the 155th Brigade and 72 soldiers of the 40th Brigade, so these are the 2 Naval Infantry Brigades, the 2 Marine, crack units, or should have been crack elite units they were at the beginning of the war. Remember, I told you they cream off the already trained troops from the other units, take the best, and then take them to the Marines. Throughout the war, they've been reconstituted somewhere between 3 and 9 times, or actually probably more now, the 155th, and they have degraded, they've diluted their experience. So the attrition rates have been horrendous, and so they are just taking mobilized troops in that don't have previous experience, and so they just become not an elite unit anymore, really. They maybe in name only. They've lost serious numbers of people. Serious losses, says Flash News, are also evidenced by the fact that Storm Z units formed from prisoners of Russian colonies began to be assigned to the composition of these brigades. That's the point. So, yeah, incredible numbers there. And I think, is that, the BBC reporting that, probably using data from their Mediazona BBC Russia analyses. So again, I assume this is the verifiable data that they can give you the proof of this from obituary reports and funerals and whatnot. And of course, that's also going to be your benchmark minimum. So there will be more. That's what the verified losses are. It's a bit like tanks. When we've got images, geolocations of all these tanks that have been lost, and we say, right, the Russians lost 8 tanks today. And here the verification of those, that's your absolute minimum. It could be that they actually lost 16, but we only know of 8. But that's your minimum. It's not going to be any less than that, but it could well be more than that. It's the same with these stats. They have lost 211 Marines from the 155th, 72 from the 40th Brigade over this time period, and that's your absolute minimum, likely much higher than that. September was the second deadliest month for Russian forces fighting in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. The daily reports from the General Staff, so again, this does depend on the General Staff being accurate with their claims, of Ukraine's armed forces show 38,130 Russian soldiers were reported as casualties. That's a really bad month, September, for the casualties, and that's exactly what you should see here. So personnel plus, okay, we've got 1,255.67 as a 30-day rolling average, but actually that 1,295 was probably for the 30 days around September, right? Of course, the 30-day rolling average doesn't have to take into account the cutoff for a month. But anyway, September as a month, if you're comparing month to month, calendar months, then that has been the worst. 7-day rolling average is not as bad as it has been. But I think the worst was probably around the time of the Kharkiv attacks from the Russians. Right, Pokrovsk region. So when we talk, again, this is actual data that you can't really argue with. Yeah, you can say there's maybe a bit of double counting or this and that, but all of these people that run these databases work really hard to eradicate double counts, etc., etc. And they're open source, and you can go and check them out yourself, etc., etc. These are visually confirmed losses. This isn't just numbers plucked out of one's posterior. So the Russians in the Pokrovsk region have lost, and this is probably from when they started attacking around there in October 2023. So this is a year of losses. The Russians have lost 1,830 vehicles, and the Ukrainians combat assets, and the Ukrainians have lost 369. Let's work that out as a percentage and see whether that is, because I talk about Pokrovsk being a 5-1, 1,830 divided by 369. That is a 4.96. So that is a 5-1 loss ratio. And since the last data analysis was done, that is actually less than 5-1. We've got 115 divided by 33. So actually, since the last time, it's 3.5. Right, so recently that has gone down. Why has it gone down? So this is where you start getting into interpretation. So the raw data is, we know that the Russians have lost 5 times as many pieces of equipment in the Pokrovsk area than the Ukrainians. And that's because they have been, and we've seen this visually, throwing massive convoys, particularly at the beginning of the offensive around Avdiivka, when they were like 30 pieces of equipment rolled in, bish bash bosh, artillery took them out. And they lost an awful lot of equipment. Ukrainians started losing. They started having shell hunger, and that caused a bit of a problem. We started seeing more and more drones being used to take out vehicles. But that ratio has kept fairly steady. But recently, it's moved from a 5-1 to a 3.5-1. Why is that? And we can start saying, well, possibly it's because the Russians aren't using as many vehicles because they've had so much attrition. We started seeing motorbikes being used. We started seeing golf buggies being used. This is empirically evidenced stuff I'm saying. I'm not making stuff up. We have seen these vehicles blown up. The Andrew Perpetual loss lists give you geolocated, visually confirmed evidence for each of those with a URL attached to his data sheets so that you can go and check it all out. So we know that that's what they're doing. Now, why are they doing that? Is it because they have a lack of the correct equipment, or is it because they like attacking enemy in a golf buggy because shits and giggles, right? So I would assume it's because they don't have enough equipment, but it could also be that there's a shift in the ratio here because the Ukrainians are starting to push back. They've brought in some reinforcements to do counters in the area, which means rather than being purely on defense, a kind of active defense means that they'll be using vehicles themselves to attack, which means the Ukrainians are going to start having an attrition of their own vehicles, more so than if they were just sitting in trenches shooting at BMPs, right? So you might then see a closing of the ratio recently because the Ukrainians have been much more actively defending Pokrovsk. We've seen that in Turets. We've seen that purely in the Pokrovsk area as well, Seledove. So yeah, there would be my speculation. You can question that if you like. Go for it. Right, then I did this earlier. I reported on this in a breaking news update. A Russian Su-25 has been shot down around Konstantinivka in Donetsk, and it's a very interesting bit of footage. As I said earlier, it appears to show a Russian plane being chased by another plane, almost certainly Russian. You very rarely get a dogfight like this, especially caught on camera. And that's because most modern fighters or interceptors are going to be firing at an enemy plane 100 kilometers away. You are firing beyond visual horizon, and you are shooting at them by logging them on a radar, locking onto them as a target. So you acquire the target using all your radar on board, but also other radars that you're linked into. And then you fire at it with a long distance missile that flies for 100 kilometers, blows up the plane. You thank you very much, I'm going to go and land. Right? And you never see each other. So that you've got two planes right next to each other and one firing at the other and blowing it up is very weird. So what explains this? In my opinion, both of these are likely Russian planes. We know the one shot down was Russian because we see pictures of its wing and etc. etc. So it's definitely Russian. We've seen all the video to know that. So it's either friendly fire, I think. I don't think the plane behind is Ukrainian. It's too close to the contact line. You're just very unlikely to get this. And also they're just flying in the same direction as each other. Like, what's going on there? There's no kind of evasive action being taken. And it's either a Russian plane shooting down another Russian plane because it's wildly incompetent, or it's a Russian plane shooting down a Russian plane because it's trying to defect. So it's following it, saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? Please come back. Please come back. No, you're not. Okay, I will shoot you down. You're not. Okay, I'm going to shoot you down. Bosh. Those are the only two plausible explanations for that. The Ukrainians have claimed that they've shot this down, but I don't think the data supports that. We've heard claims that it's air defences. I don't think that's obviously not the case. It's another plane doing that. So yeah, let me know what you think. I think it's either defect or friendly fire. Yeah, one of those two. Right. So there, just to let you know, it's not always the Russian columns that get absolutely hammered. This is a really bad bit of footage. It's a long video, 13 minutes of a Ukrainian column getting absolutely, or as this guy said, as Simplicius, who is a proper Russian, pro-Russian account, says 2 Russian BTRs decimate Ukrainian NATO-equipped column in Kursk ambush. Now, this is what has happened. It is, not good. So War Vehicle Tracker says, below you can see 2 well-positioned BTR-82As ambush a Ukrainian convoy in Kursk. Now, I don't think this is actually from October 3rd. I think this is right from the beginning of the Kursk invasion, and it's just come out now, rather than, because I think he talks about, this is drone footage from a previously known attack about 1.5 months ago, where Ukraine lost 6 Rochelles, Cossacks, and Humvees. The BTR-82As from the 801st were well positioned to caught the convoy off guard, as it seems. So you can see lots of imagery of these, and I think he's cut out the ones with like dead bodies and whatnot. This was not good for the Ukrainians. They lost a lot of equipment and no doubt a number of troops as well, which is exactly the sort of thing that's going to happen if you are attacking. So this is why I go back to Pokrovsk. If you're defending, you ain't going to lose as much equipment. It's a 5-to-1 ratio. Russians attacking, throwing equipment like this, like you see on this video, throwing equipment at the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians going, thank you very much, we'll eat that up. All we need is just well-positioned defences and enough ammunition to be able to do the job. The same is going to happen with the Ukrainians attacking into Kursk. Now, at times, the Ukrainians made really quick advances because the Russians were caught off guard, etc., etc. But at other times, the Russians did a good job at repelling Ukrainian attacks. And this is one example where they lost an awful lot of kit. As Simplicius here says, the Marines destroyed 8 vehicles in a crossfire, with others retreating or being eliminated by reinforcements. BTR crews stopped the Ukrainian armoured advance, with Marines saying the enemy's nightmare at the sight of our BTRs is just beginning. So, of course, it's very pro-Russian interpretation of what happened. Kursk front, 2 Russian Marine BTR-82As ambushed a column of 19 NATO vehicles from the Ukrainian 82nd Brigade. Whether that many were destroyed in that, I don't know. The evidence, War Vehicle Tracker, seems to suggest that 6 were taken out, but I don't know anymore without looking much more in detail at that. But not a good event for the Ukrainians there. And of course, that's war. You're going to lose there'll be times where you have a nightmare and you lose. It could be based on bad decisions. It could be based on just being surprised, the Russians being in a much better position than you were anticipating and doing a better job, etc., etc. Okay. Paratroopers from the 79th Air Assault Brigade have successfully repelled another assault by Russian forces in the Karakova direction. So on the reverse side of things, this kind of assault and losing that kind of equipment is something that Russians are doing on a daily basis. We've seen, 17 vehicles were taken out was in the Vovchansk area recently, 16 NTLBs out of 17, and then 1 tank. That was an absolute nightmare for the Russians. And then here we have the Karakova direction. So just north of the Konstantinivka that was just mentioned, where the airplane came down, around sort of Mariinka, basically, that part of the front line, below the Pokrovsk front, and not as far as Vuhledar. So in the middle, you got Karakova as one of the places where the Russians are really concentrating on. The attack involved 10 military vehicles, including a tank, 9 armored vehicles. Ukrainian forces destroyed the tank and 5 armoured vehicles. So that's a 50% destruction rate of the vehicles here, damaging another and also destroying a buggy attempting to reach their position. So actually more vehicles destroyed. As a result, 20 Russian soldiers were killed and 23 were wounded. And that is, that's another example of some pretty attritional warfare going on along the front lines. And here we have, I just thought I'd throw this in, we have at least two, I don't know how many in total are there, but there's evidence of at least 2 Challenger 2 main battle tanks. These are the British provided main battle tanks that are in service in Ukraine, and they are working in Kursk here. This is up in Kursk, that as according to other sources, supporting folding anti-drone netting, and on the way there, as often they do, they ride with their turret backwards. You see this with a number of tanks, better weight distribution for speedy movement outside of a battle zone. So that's why they do that. Quite often you see that. Moving on to distant strikes. So we're going to start with the news that just 3 drones were shot down overnight. However, they only fired 13, the Russians. So 3 out of 13 were shot down, leaving 10. But then the other 10 were successfully messed with by means of electronic warfare. So 100% of what the Russians sent in were taken out. So that's really good news. 3 guided air missiles were fired, which were not intercepted. Since the report, others have hit frontline regions of Ukraine. So some missile damage having been done by the Russians. Don't quite know where that is at the moment. Fairly typical of them giving consistent damage with missiles on a nightly basis. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have had some success overnight. So first of all, in Luhansk, occupied Luhansk, a drone hit something which may have been interesting. This was in Belovodsk, north of Luhansk city and just 20 kilometers from the border with Russia. I think I've seen that this might have been, so you can catch it there, big explosion. It might have been an ammo depot there that was taken out. I'm pretty sure that was an ammo depot, which is going to be very useful. We've seen 3 ammo depots taken out recently, large ones at Toropets, etc., etc. And there is news now that has caused widespread shell hunger. Well, I don't know how widespread, but at least some amount of shell hunger for the Russians, which is what we're expecting, but really good news for the Ukrainians. Ukrainian drones have been busy against this Tim White elsewhere. Once again, in Voronezh region, the local governor says, quote, a fire broke out at a civilian production facility, injuring 1 person. It appears to have been an ethanol plant in Novokopyrsk. Again, 500 kilometers from Ukraine. Interesting, it's 500 kilometers from Ukraine. That is, again, another really successful deep strike. Next, it says drones attacked the most beloved of Russians' entities, distilleries in Belgorod and Voronezh regions. Distilleries in Staroskol and Novokopersky were attacked. So this is, going back to Tim White's video there, appears to be a distillery. Now, an ethanol distillery, so possibly involved in alcohol manufacture for recreational use, I don't know, or maybe for use elsewhere. But yeah, I don't know why that would be targeted 500 kilometers away by drones. So there must be some reason that manufacturing facility would have been hit rather than just a commercial strike. I'm fairly sure the Ukrainians will be concentrating on military targets when you have a scarcity of resources. In Belgorod region, Ukraine drones have hit a manufacturing plant. Part of the factory at Peshchanka collapsed and a fire started. No other details. So this is the claim that's a Belgorod manufacturing plant, but actually that's the same video by the looks of it as is mentioned here. So that could be, this second one could be the Stary Oskol in Belgorod, and the other one is Novokopersky Distillery in Voronezh. I don't know, but that's what the claims are. No further details, at least that I can find at the moment. Now, we have seen the first, I think this is the first imagery of the Palyantsia drone. So this is the jet-propelled drone, if I've got that right, that the Ukrainians have worked on, that is essentially a kind of cruise missile. Unless it is, I presume you can control it as it's flying rather than just send it to the destination. So anyway, I'll play this with a sound to give you a sense of what this drone can do, how fast it can go. So that's not something you're going to be able to shoot down particularly easily. It's traveling at quite a clip. That is adding to the Ukrainian capability in terms of distance strikes. Yeah, we might see that be used more and more if they can scale up the production of that. Now, fascinating that Ukraine have supposedly killed 6 officers from the DPRK. So these are North Koreans in a missile attack. So 6 North Korean officers were among 20 soldiers killed in a missile strike near Donetsk on October the 3rd. 3 more North Korean soldiers were wounded. If you remember right at the beginning of the war, I don't know if you were watching my channel then, probably not, but there were some strikes on some Shahid drone training facilities or launch facilities where Iranian officers and trainers were located. So the Iranians lost some at the closer to the beginning of the war. This is a case of North Korean soldiers being killed and wounded. 3 more North Korean soldiers were wounded, apparently. They came to a meeting with a Russian command. It showed them the training of personnel for assault and defense. So this shows obviously that the Russians are using a lot of North Korean munitions. I'd assume these will be missiles that they're training on. Anyway, they've been hit by a Ukrainian missile attack. Interesting stats today that are claimed that the Russians are using 50% of their artillery ammunition that they're using is apparently North Korean. So are the Russians in a bit of a desperate situation with artillery ammunition? You'd think that's the one thing that they've got a lot of, and that, of course, historically they have, but they've chomped through those reserves and they have maxed out, I think, their production. They claim to be able to produce, was it 2-point-something million a year? That's not enough to fire at the rates they've been used to since the beginning of the war, and they are evidently taking an awful lot off the North Koreans. Now, this is the Telegram channel that first broke the news of the North Korean officers being killed. I don't know if this tells us anything. 3 more officers from the DPRK were wounded and sent to Moscow for treatment, according to our sources in the Ministry of Defense. They showed friendly soldiers how our soldiers prepare for assault operations for defense, how we resist American weapons. So this is actually, it seems to be that they were showing North Koreans how to do things rather than North Koreans showing the Russians how to work their weaponry. It could well be that this is North Koreans being shown how to do war, and indeed being shown how to die in war. Unfortunately, there was a missile strike on a training ground. In total, more than 20 people were killed, 6 of them our friends, officers from North Korea. So that's coming from a Russian source. Okay, moving on to other bits and pieces. Let's start with around 80% of all executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war by Russian forces occurred in 2024. In other words, this is a growing phenomenon whereby the Russians are executing POWs against the laws of war. These are war crimes. 93 Ukrainian troops have been confirmed killed in 2024. Yuri Bielusov, head of the Department of Combating Crimes Committed in Armed Conflict, has shared that during a TV broadcast. So that's pretty macabre information. In September, Russia expanded its control of Ukraine by approximately 467.7 square kilometers, says War Mapper, the largest monthly gain for Russia since March 2022. They also retook control of approximately 125.9 square kilometers of the territory in Kursk. So the Russians have eventually taken a fair chunk of that Kursk area salient back from the Ukrainians. The question is, how much are Ukrainians going to hang on to that? What resources are Russians going to be putting into taking back that territory? Will they be attrited at a rate that is problematic for the Russians? You know, all sorts to understand from that. Total net Russian gain of 593.6 kilometers overall. As of the end of September, Russia occupies 17.86% of Ukrainian territory overall. And that is an increase in that month of 0.08% of Ukraine, including Crimea and the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk occupied before 2022, shown in purple. So we have, obviously, you know, February and March even more, and then it's been fairly stable since, November 2022, really. Very minimal changes to Ukrainian occupied territory. This second chart illustrates how Russian control has evolved since the invasion began in February 2022. So really the red area and two little blips up there is what the Russians have achieved since the beginning of the war. Obviously the purple areas were part of the 2014 invasion. Sorry. This series of charts shows control over time in the 4 oblasts in Ukraine with active moving fronts. Russia is steadily progressing on all fronts with more rapid advances in Donetsk. So this is Donetsk, and you can see, you know, that expansion is far more rapid than, say, Luhansk. So that is where you've got Pokrovsk. You've also got further up, you've got Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. You've got Vuhledar down at the very bottom. So all of that eastern front, really, the main part of the eastern front from sort of Serebyansky forest downwards, that's where they're having the most success. Luhansk, this is going to be this increase where I think around Kupiansk maybe, and a little bit further to the south, Pischane, they've taken quite a bit. So that's probably Pischane area there that's been taken. And then Kharkiv, it's been fairly stable for the entire time since they invaded into there. And Zaporizhia, really not a lot of change, just minimal, really 0.06%. And finally, here's a look at the progression of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk since the operation there began. Ukrainian control there peaked around 6th of September at 2.84%. I presume that's of Kursk. It went up fairly quickly and then plateaued. Took a little bit more there, and then since that has come down. So that's where they are at. Good stuff from War Mapper. Right, Jane Kiev says, I'm going to show you this. I'm not going to put the sound on, but it is worth understanding how horrific it was in Vuhledar just before the Ukrainians pulled out. To get an idea of what Russians have done to every Ukrainian town they now call Russia, the final days of Vuhledar before the Ukrainian army pulled out, completely leveled with guided bombs, MLRS and artillery. Russian troops then move in to plant a flag on the rubble. This is the plan for all of Europe with the backing of North Korea, China, Iran and the resources of a growing list of African nations. NATO will regret not only just allowing Ukraine to take down Putin now, not just allowing Ukraine to take down Putin. So yeah, all of these flashes, huge explosions, just it's a tiny place really, Vuhledar. It's just these big old apartment blocks in the middle of nowhere. Well, not in the middle of nowhere, it's near a mine. So it's a mining town where you've got purpose-built apartment blocks, and they're just getting absolutely rinsed. And that is just, 20 seconds? 15, however long? 20 seconds of what the Russians have done over several years to Vuhledar. It's horrific. Right, I've done these threads before. This is from Carl, who is... It's a really sizable thread. He gives his analysis of the war in general. He's, I think, an Estonian military analyst that Michael Weiss occasionally dips into. I know this might take a little bit of time, but I think these are really useful. And this has been quite a long one. Okay, last time we discussed that the situation in Vuhledar had become critical for the Ukrainians. By now, it's been abandoned. In summary, Russia's offensive towards Vuhledar began a year ago with an attack on Novomyrkylivka. The situation in Vuhledar itself started to become uncomfortable a few months ago. The main reason Russia is advancing there, like along the entire eastern front, is that it's hard to defend against Russian bombs. If Russian bombers get close and drop glide bombs, or sooner or later Ukrainian positions are destroyed and they must retreat. The key question on the eastern front is whether Ukraine has a strong enough defensive positions beyond Vuhledar to the north and west. If new positions are in place and the Russian losses become beyond Vuhledar are significant enough, it's possible to halt the front. The next couple of weeks will show whether Ukraine's defensive lines are strong enough. If the positions aren't there, it could turn out like after Avdiivka, where Russia was able to move forward right after capturing the city. That's why they're in Vuhledar today. Under Bakhmut, the Russians couldn't achieve this. With minor exceptions, they are in almost the same place in Bakhmut as they were a year and a half ago. Good point. If the front halts behind Vuhledar, losing Vuhledar wouldn't be too tragic. At the start of the war, less than 20,000 people lived there. Russia took 2.5 years to capture it, and considering how many Russian troops were killed in 3 to 4 large attack waves and how much Russian armour was destroyed, it's a very high price. At the same time, Vuhledar was the southeastern corner of the front. If Russia continues advancing, the front could potentially move both north and west. This is a risk. If Russia pushes this corner, the front may shift in both directions. Russia's offensive pace elsewhere on the eastern front has clearly slowed down, but a few weeks ago, the situation in Pokrovsk was critical. But now Russia is advancing very, very slowly there. Ukraine has managed to stop a major push there. This is still a Russian offensive from the Karakova. There is still a Russian offensive in the Karakova direction. Elsewhere on the front, Russia has exerted pressure between Kupiansk and Liman, so that's that northeastern axis, but hasn't been able to advance on the larger towns. They pushed toward the Oskil River, and there have been some success. But it's still on a tactical level. There's no visible threat of Russia being able to cross the river. In Kursk, the positions have stabilized. Russia launched a major attack, which was unsuccessful. Russia has enough units there to prevent Ukraine from further advancing, but not enough to push forward themselves. Broadly speaking, positional warfare continues, but neither side has clear defensive lines. This allows special forces units to inflict damage on the enemy, but not to capture new territory. Near Vovchansk in the Kharkiv direction, Russia was driven out from the aggregates plant. The major offensive Russia launched under Kharkiv in the spring ended with less success than Ukrainians' southern offensive last summer. In other words, Russia attacking into Kharkiv took less land than the Ukrainians took when they attacked in Robotna and Velika Novosilka in the south, which weren't seen as particularly successful. The overall picture is not as bad as one might read in the Western media, where it seems Ukraine is on the brink of collapse. I don't see that, but Ukraine certainly doesn't have the strength to take the initiative across the entire front. The initiative is either in Russia's hands or in neither side's. It's now clear that Russia has gotten its Shahid industry up and running, something I've been talking about an awful lot. Almost every night, 25 to 30 Shahids head towards Ukraine. Ukraine's ability to shoot them down is good, but occasionally some still manage to get through the air defences. There are also days when Ukrainians shoot down all the Shahids or suppress them with electronic warfare measures, but Russia still keeps Ukraine's air defences and population under constant pressure. It's a psychological effect, isn't there? The ongoing air alerts are unpleasant and mentally exhausting. Russia received information from Iran in the summer of 2023 on how to produce Shahids. Shoigu at the time promised mass production by the end of the year. In reality, they got it by the end of July to August of this year. However, the number of Russian missile strikes remains relatively low. It's rare for them to launch more than 10 missiles at a time. More often, it's 2 to 3 missiles a day. It's clear that Ukraine can shoot down certain types of missiles, while others can only be intercepted with Patriot systems. Russia constantly attacks Kiev with Shahids, but missiles don't get through there. So Russia doesn't launch many missiles towards Kiev. In the past week, Khmelnytsky Oblast, that's where the Starokonstantinov air base is, where they launched the planes with Storm Shadows previously. They hadn't seen many Storm Shadows being launched of late. Anyway, Russia doesn't launch many missiles towards Kiev. In the past weeks, Khmelnytsky Oblast and its military airfields have been attacked several times. Russia's goal is to hinder the successful integration of F-16s. Although they haven't hit any planes, if they cause technical problems at air bases, it will slow down the use of F-16s. The events in the Middle East have a mixed effect on the war in Ukraine. The whole Middle Eastern conflict draws attention away from the war in Ukraine, which isn't good from Ukrainian perspective, but at some point the opposite effect begins to emerge. Western countries realize that with specific states or structures that speak only the language of force, you can only respond in kind. The theory of de-escalation doesn't work with them. Iran is falling into a trap and its actual military capabilities are being exposed. The lack of means to cause significant damage to Israel. Iran's leadership fears that what happened to Hamas and Hezbollah leaders could happen to them as well. If the West provided Ukraine with technology at the same level as Israel's, the war could be changed significantly, but they're still dealing with the question of long-range missiles. If you're fighting, you can't impose restrictions on yourself that force you to fight with one hand tied behind your back. The US has constantly imposed such limits on Ukraine. Israel's actions clearly show that the results are better when you don't hold back against certain types of regimes. Russia doesn't fare well when the allies get beaten. Their allies get beaten. Russia certainly can't rely on as much help from Iran as would otherwise be possible, but I still doubt that the current US administration can articulate this clearly to themselves. In rhetorical terms, France is better. In Macron's circle, the issue is framed like this: Russia must learn to respect the West again. This is the right understanding. In the Russian language, respect means fear. Really interesting that Emmanuel Macron, this is me talking now, has come out and said that we have double standards with regards to Israel and Ukraine. That is significant, Macron saying that. So he's going against like an American double standards. Anyway, for him to continue, respect and fear are synonymous in Russian culture. If you're not afraid, then there's no respect. The West doesn't understand this. I don't draw big conclusions from Russia's budget. We can't infer much from those numbers. Russia's defense budget has been opaque to the West in the last 15 to 20 years. We can't verify that it's really what's really going on there. I tend to view Russia's rising defense expenditures as an information operation, like we have reserves, so don't expect to defeat us. The biggest problem with Ukraine's victory plan is in strategic communication. Washington officials have expressed cautious support, but first, they let anonymous sources fill US media with talk, and there's little optimism. It's inappropriate to demand that Ukraine come up with an independent victory plan. Although Ukraine's military industry capabilities are improving, Ukraine cannot defeat Russia in the coming years. This is only possible alone, that's a really important word. Ukraine alone cannot defeat Russia in the coming years. This is only possible together with the USA and the EU. Asking where is your victory plan is cynical. It shows they don't want to invest in themselves. And that's exactly what I've been saying for ages. Brilliant thread there from Carl, the Estonian intelligence analyst. Right. Belarus has sentenced 12 people over the sabotage of Russian A-50 military plane. A Minsk court has sentenced 12 people to prison over the sabotage of the Machulishki military airfield in Belarus last year, Vyazna said. Some sentences were handed down in absentia. The airfield near Minsk had been used by the Russian military during Moscow's war against Ukraine. Belarusian partisans allegedly carried out a sabotage act on the 26th of February 2023, damaging a Russian A-50 early warning and control aircraft. I think that was the one with a drone, where a drone landed on top of it, and I think then exploded. In Russia's Altai region, it is another dam has burst. It's dam burst season again. Local residents report problems with accessibility, with towns and villages cut off from each other. We've seen this over the course of the last year. Investment's gone down, I guess, in maintenance of these sort of facilities and whatnot. And rain has been an issue, water, climate, etc., etc. There have been a number of dam breakages, which then put strain on the Russian ability to farm that land. That's been hit. Don't underestimate what has been done by both flooding and droughts in terms of the Russian ability to produce food. Now, that will affect global food supplies, but it will also affect income to Russia to support the war, and stuff like this only costs Russia. So if you're looking from a purely military strategic point of view in terms of the war against Ukraine, this kind of stuff is good for Ukraine. Anyway, that's enough for me. It was a long one. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.